Welcome to Compact Warfare from CompactHistories.com, the show where we explore key moments from the history of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare. This is episode 82, the Battle of Wakefield. By the winter of 1460, England was no longer simply a troubled kingdom. It was a country in which the question of who should rule had become impossible to avoid. The Wars of the Roses had already seen years of political rivalry, armed confrontation, and uneasy truces, but the crisis now turned on one central issue: whether Henry VI could continue as king, and if not, who had the stronger claim to replace him. Henry VI had inherited the throne as a baby in 1422, but his reign had been marked by military failure abroad and weakness at home. England had lost most of its possessions in France, royal authority had declined, and powerful noble families had begun to settle disputes by force. Henry himself was pious and gentle, but he was also politically ineffective, and his periods of mental collapse made the problem worse. When he could not govern, others had to govern for him. One of the most important of those men was Richard, Duke of York. York was not merely a powerful aristocrat. He had royal blood through both sides of his ancestry, and believed he had a legitimate claim to guide, and eventually perhaps inherit, the kingdom. His rivalry with the Lancastrian court had grown over many years, especially with figures close to the king and queen. At first, York presented himself as a reformer, claiming he wanted to remove corrupt advisors and restore good government. Yet, as violence escalated, his position became more ambitious. In July 1460, Yorkist forces won a major victory at the Battle of Northampton. Henry VI was captured, giving the Yorkists control of the king's person and temporarily the machinery of government. In October, the Act of Accord attempted to settle the crisis. It allowed Henry VI to remain king for life, but named Richard of York as his heir. This was a dramatic compromise, but it came at a huge cost. It disinherited Henry's young son, Prince Edward of Westminster. For Queen Margaret of Anjou, that was intolerable. She had fought fiercely to protect her husband's throne and her son's future, and she had no intention of accepting a settlement that cut Edward out of the succession. The Act of Accord did not end the conflict. It sharpened it. Supporters of the Lancastrian royal line gathered in the north, where several powerful nobles had old grievances against York and his allies. Richard of York had won a legal victory in Parliament, but law meant little unless it could be defended in the field. By late 1460, the decisive struggle had shifted away from Westminster and towards Yorkshire, where armies were forming and old enemies were preparing to strike. Richard of York's position after the Act of Accord seemed strong on paper. He had been named heir to the throne, he held great estates, and Henry VI was in Yorkist hands. Yet the political map of England told a more dangerous story. The Lancastrian cause was far from broken. Its supporters were reorganizing, especially in the north, where local loyalties, family rivalries, and resentment against Yorkist power made the region a natural center of resistance. York had deep connections with the north, but that did not mean he controlled it. His main northern base was Sandal Castle, near Wakefield, a stronghold that gave access to his Yorkshire lands. However, several of his enemies were also powerful in the region. Henry Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and John Clifford, Lord Clifford, all had reasons to oppose York. Some were loyal to Henry VI and Queen Margaret. Others had private debts to settle. Clifford, in particular, had lost his father at the First Battle of St Albans in 1455, where Yorkist forces had killed several leading Lancastrians. The Civil War was political, but it was also personal. Queen Margaret herself was not at Wakefield, but her determination shaped the campaign. She had refused to accept the disinheritance of her son, and Lancastrian commanders acted in defense of Prince Edward's claim. Their aim was not just to oppose York's influence, it was to destroy the settlement that had made him heir to the throne. York travelled north in late 1460 with a force that was probably smaller than the Lancastrian army gathering against him. Exact numbers are uncertain, as medieval sources are often inconsistent and exaggerated, but most accounts agree that York was at a disadvantage. He was accompanied by important allies, including his second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury. Salisbury was one of the most experienced Yorkist commanders, but even his presence did not remove the danger. The timing was poor. It was December. Campaigning conditions were difficult, and York may have believed he needed to act before Lancastrian strength grew even further. He may also have expected reinforcements, possibly from his eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, who was active in the Welsh marches. Yet those reinforcements were not immediately available. By the end of December, York and his men were at Sandal Castle. Outside, Lancastrian forces were close enough to threaten him, but not necessarily close enough to force an immediate assault on the castle. This created the question that has shaped debate about Wakefield ever since. Why did York leave a defensible position and fight in the open? Sandal Castle stood on high ground south of Wakefield, overlooking the surrounding landscape. It was not just a residence but a fortified base, and in theory, it gave Richard of York an advantage. A commander facing a larger enemy might normally stay behind walls, conserve supplies, wait for help, or force the opposing army to attack on unfavourable terms. Yet Wakefield is remembered precisely because York did not remain safely inside. The reasons are still debated because the evidence is incomplete, and later accounts add drama that may not be reliable. One explanation is that York was tricked. Some chronicles suggest that part of the Lancastrian army showed itself while other troops were hidden nearby, encouraging York to believe he faced a smaller force than he really did. If true, that would make Wakefield a classic battlefield trap, with York drawn out and then surrounded. Another possibility is that York was under pressure from a shortage of supplies. A castle could protect men, but only if it was stocked well enough to withstand a siege. In late December, with a hostile army nearby, provisions may have been a serious concern. If York believed he could not remain inside for long, then an attempt to break out or strike first might have seemed necessary. A third explanation is honour and political pressure. York was not simply a military commander, he was the man Parliament had recognised as heir to the throne. If he allowed himself to be penned inside his own castle while his enemies ravaged the surrounding area, his authority might suffer. Medieval aristocratic culture placed huge value on reputation, courage, and decisive action. A nobleman who appeared passive could lose confidence among supporters. There may also have been confusion over negotiations, intelligence, or local movements. Medieval armies did not operate with modern communications. Reports could be late, wrong, or deliberately misleading. Commanders made decisions based on partial information, and a poor judgment made at the wrong moment could destroy an army. What seems clear is that the Lancastrians had the advantage of numbers and position. Their commanders were experienced, motivated, and gathered for a specific purpose, to defeat York before he could consolidate the settlement created by the Act of Accord. Whether through deception, pressure, or York's own miscalculation, they were able to bring him out from the protection of Sandal Castle. On the 30th of December 1460, York's force moved out into the open ground near Wakefield. The decision transformed the campaign. What had been a tense standoff around a fortress became a battle in which the weaker side had little margin for error. Once York committed himself outside the castle walls, the Lancastrians had the opportunity they needed. The Battle of Wakefield was probably short, brutal, and chaotic. Unlike some medieval battles that unfolded over several phases, Wakefield appears to have been decided quickly once Richard of York's army was engaged. The Yorkists had left the relative safety of Sandal Castle and now faced a larger Lancastrian force on open ground. If York had expected a limited engagement, a smaller enemy, or a chance to break through, the reality proved disastrous. The battlefield lay near Wakefield, close to Sandal Castle, although the exact details of troop movement remain uncertain. Medieval chroniclers did not provide the kind of precise battlefield mapping that modern readers might want. What they do suggest is that York's men were overwhelmed. Some accounts describe Lancastrian troops attacking from more than one direction, which supports the idea that York had been drawn into a trap. If hidden forces appeared after the battle began, the Yorkists may have found themselves surrounded or attacked before they could form a stable line. The Lancastrian commanders had strong reasons to show no mercy. This was not a formal tournament or a limited quarrel between nobles. The Yorkist leadership had altered the succession, threatened the future of Prince Edward, and humiliated the Lancastrian court by holding Henry VI. For men such as Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford, Wakefield offered the chance to reverse the political settlement by eliminating the man at its centre. York himself was killed in or shortly after the fighting. Later stories gave different versions of his death, some claiming he was mocked before being executed, others suggesting he died fighting. What is certain is that he did not survive the battle. His army collapsed, and the defeat became a slaughter of senior Yorkist figures. His 17-year-old son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also killed. Tradition held that he was captured and murdered by Lord Clifford in revenge for the death of Clifford's father at St Albans. The details are difficult to prove, and later accounts may have embroidered the scene, but Edmund's death became one of the most notorious moments associated with Wakefield. It reinforced the sense that the conflict had moved beyond political rivalry into dynastic vengeance. The Earl of Salisbury was captured and executed soon afterwards, removing another major Yorkist leader. The losses were therefore not limited to ordinary soldiers or battlefield casualties. Wakefield destroyed the senior command structure of the Yorkist movement in the north. For the Lancastrians, it was a spectacular success. They had killed the Duke of York, the man declared heir to the throne, and had removed several of his closest allies. For the Yorkists, it was a catastrophe that might have ended their cause completely. Yet the consequences of Wakefield did not stop at the battlefield. The treatment of the dead turned military victory into political theatre. The death of Richard of York was more than the fall of a noble commander. It was the destruction of the man who, only weeks earlier, had stood closest to replacing the Lancastrian line. Parliament had recognised his claim through the Act of Accord, and his enemies understood the symbolic value of killing him. Wakefield did not just remove York from the struggle. It allowed the Lancastrians to declare that his challenge to Henry VI and Prince Edward had failed. The aftermath was deliberately brutal. Richard of York's head was placed on Micklegate Bar in York, the traditional southern entrance to the city. According to well-known accounts, it was displayed wearing a paper crown, a mocking reference to his claim to the throne. Whether every detail of the story is exact or shaped by later retelling, the message was unmistakable. York had reached for royal authority and had been destroyed. The heads of other Yorkist leaders were also displayed. This was not unusual in medieval politics, where public punishment and bodily display were used to warn enemies and assert control. Yet in the context of the Wars of the Roses, it deepened the bitterness between the rival factions. The killing of nobles in battle was one thing, humiliation after death was another. It made reconciliation harder and revenge more likely. The death of Edmund, Earl of Rutland, added another layer of horror. As York's son, he represented the future of the dynasty. His killing showed that the Lancastrian victory was aimed not merely at defeating an army, but at breaking a family line. Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, was another major loss, especially because the Nevilles were among the most important Yorkist allies in England. His execution strengthened the sense that Wakefield had been a targeted political purge as much as a battlefield victory. Yet the Lancastrian success created its own problem. By killing Richard of York, they did not erase the Yorkist claim. They passed it to his eldest surviving son, Edward, Earl of March. Edward was young, energetic, militarily capable, and now personally invested in revenge. Wakefield removed a cautious and politically experienced father, but it left behind a son who would pursue the cause with greater urgency. The Lancastrians had won a dramatic victory, but they had not captured or killed Edward, nor had they restored stable authority across the kingdom. Henry VI remained a weak figure, Queen Margaret remained dependent on military success, and the kingdom remained divided. Wakefield had settled nothing permanently. It had simply raised the stakes. The heads on Micklegate Bar were meant to proclaim Lancastrian triumph. Instead, they became a provocation. The Yorkist cause had suffered a devastating blow, but it was not dead. Its leadership now shifted to Edward of March, and the war moved rapidly towards an even wider struggle. The Battle of Wakefield changed the Wars of the Roses, because it transformed a dispute over influence and succession into a more ruthless dynastic struggle. Before Wakefield, Richard of York had sought recognition within the framework of Henry VI's reign. The Act of Accord had attempted a compromise, however unstable, by allowing Henry to remain king while making York his heir. After Wakefield, compromise became far less likely. Too much blood had been spilt, and too many leading figures had been killed. For the Lancastrians, the immediate result was encouraging. Their northern army had destroyed York's force, killed the man who threatened Prince Edward's inheritance, and regained momentum. Queen Margaret's position was strengthened, and Lancastrian supporters could argue that God and battle had rejected York's ambition. Yet their victory still had to be converted into national control, and that was much harder. The Yorkist response came through Edward, Earl of March. At just 18, he inherited his father's claim and responsibilities at a moment of crisis. He could have been overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, but instead, he acted decisively. In February 1461, only weeks after Wakefield, Edward defeated a Lancastrian force at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire. That victory showed that the Yorkist cause had survived, and that its new leader was a serious military figure. At almost the same time, another Lancastrian army fought the Earl of Warwick at the Second Battle of St. Albans. The Lancastrians won and recovered Henry VI, but their conduct and their failure to secure London damaged their political position. London was crucial. Without its support, military success could not easily become lasting government. Edward moved towards the capital and presented himself not merely as his father's heir, but as an alternative king. In March 1461, he was proclaimed Edward IV. The logic of the conflict had shifted. The question was no longer who should advise Henry VI or inherit after him. It was which King England would obey. Wakefield therefore stands as one of the decisive turning points of the Wars of the Roses. It was a Lancastrian victory in the immediate military sense, but it also helped produce the conditions for Yorkist kingship. By killing Richard of York, the Lancastrians removed one claimant and created another with the motive, support, and ability to seize the throne outright. The escalation reached its terrifying peak at the Battle of Towton on the 29th of March 1461, one of the largest and bloodiest battles fought on English soil. There, Edward IV's forces defeated the Lancastrians and secured his crown, at least for the time being. Wakefield had been meant to crush the Yorkist challenge. Instead, it became the spark that drove the Yorkists from opposition into open kingship and pushed England into the bloodiest phase of its civil war. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Warfare, part of the Compact Histories Network. Please don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening so that you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving us a rating or a review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find new episodes at compacthistories.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, science, mysteries, true crime, and disasters. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/warfare and click on the coffee cup to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.